Welcome to to the Tuesday seminar. We have a panel today that was not scheduled at the beginning of the semester, in part because this is it's covering a really important but recently unfolding development, which is the extraordinarily important judicial reform taking place right now in Mexico. And I am, first of all, really thankful to the Dr. Class staff and to our three panelists for agreeing at a relatively late date to join this panel. So thank you very, very much. We're going to have three different takes on the question of why this judicial reform came about and what its potential consequences are for Mexican democracy, which is, I don't know if it's a question we're all asking, but it's the question that I'm asking. And then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So let me introduce our three speakers in their order of appearance, and then they will speak and we will jump into discussion. We will be led off by Julio Rios Figueroa, who is professor in the Department of Law at ITAM in Mexico City. He is a PhD in politics from NYU and previously taught at was professor of political science at CIDE before moving to ITAM. His research focuses on comparative judicial politics, rule of law, empirical legal studies, really across Latin America. He's published widely, including a great book entitled Courts in Latin America, which he put together with Gretchen Helke a little over a decade ago from Cambridge University Press. Julio, it is terrific, an honor to have you here. Thank you. Our second speaker is Veronica Michel, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at John Jay College in the CUNY system. Her research focuses primarily on victims' rights, public prosecutors' offices, procedural justice, and the rule of law in Latin America. Dr. Michel is co-editor with Robin Holder and Alice Bosma of the Research Handbook on Victims' Rights and Justice. Veronica, it's great to have you. Thanks for coming. And our third speaker really doesn't work on Mexico at all. Maria Ballesteros, but she has a lot to say. Maria Ballesteros is, many of you know her, she's a PhD candidate here in the Harvard Government Department. And her work is primarily on the social and political consequences of exposure to political violence. She works on how the relationship between power, geography, gender, and internal displacement during Civil War. And in particular recently on how the mobilization of women influences processes and outcomes of civil war. She's done a lot of work in Afghanistan, but she recently published, along with Andrew O'Donoghue, who's also here, a really terrific piece in foreign policy on the judicial reform. And so we're very lucky that she crossed the road and joined us. And she'll speak third. So we lead off with Julio. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, and the organizers for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to share the panel with such wonderful colleagues. So the motivating questions for today's seminar are two. Why did the Mexican government pursue the judicial reform, and what are the consequences for democracy? I will focus mostly on the first one, on the first question. I want to make in my time three main points. First, that it is important to analyze the judicial reform in the context of democratic erosion in Mexico. Second, I want to share with you some of the motivations behind the reform that I think are a combination of backward and forward-looking considerations. And lastly, I will focus on a general consequence, perhaps the main one for Mexico, that is this reform, along with others, probably is depriving Mexico of the democratic mechanisms of self-correction. So I will build on these 3 points in my remaining time. But first, for the general audience, I wanted to include a brief description of the judicial reform. Like, I will take a couple of minutes. So the reform, of course, involves the popular election of all judges in the country at the state and the federal level. So we are talking about 1,600 federal judges at the district and circuit levels, plus the Supreme Court, 9 members, Electoral Tribunal, 7 members, and a new Tribunal of Judicial Discipline, 5 members. The election of all those federal judges will take place in 2 parts. Half of the vacancies that were selected by lottery 1 month ago will be elected on June 1st, 2025, and the other half on June 2027. Lawyers with 5 years of working experience who present 5 letters of recommendations from friends or neighbors and a GPA in their law degree of at least 8 out of 10 can register to participate in the election. There can be up to 30 candidates for each position, selected by 3 committees, 1 in the legislative, 1 in the executive, and 1 in the judicial branch. Each committee selects up to 10 candidates for each position based on the formal requirements I mentioned, plus an interview. These committees are an ex-ante screening mechanism for those who want to become judges. For half of the positions in the federal judiciary, there are going to be, so just to give you an idea of the numbers, for half of the positions in the federal judiciary that are going to be selected next June, we could have up to 24,000 candidates, up to 30 candidates for each one of the 800 positions. Another feature of the reform is the creation of a Tribunal of Judicial Discipline, 5 members popularly elected. This tribunal will review the performance of elected judges on an annual basis, and it will also receive complaints against federal judges. The complaints can be made regarding procedural, administrative, and substantive issues in specific cases. So the tribunal will serve as an ex post check on judges' performance. And the last main feature of the reform is the faceless or anonymous judges. That is, the reform specifies that judges who decide cases related to organized crime will have their identity concealed for security purposes. So that's, in very broad terms, the judicial reform. So my first point, Mexico is in a process of democratic erosion, and the reform has to be understood in this context. And I think it's better understood in this context. So the judicial reform is a bad reform in the sense that it does not address the real problems that the Mexican justice system have, like impunity, corruption, and a precarious access to justice. And it will also create new problems. So among other things, the judicial reform entails the election of judges, as I said, the tribunal and the faceless judges. However, the judicial reform does not touch the prosecutorial organs. Veronica is going to talk about that, nor the tribunals that are already under executive control, such as the military tribunals, the agrarian tribunals, or the administrative tribunals. So the reform does not touch the main sources of impunity and corruption within the justice system. Instead, the reform creates new problems. It is a regressive reform that finishes judicial independence with the ex ante and ex post mechanisms of control. It limits the protection of rights and concentrates powers in the executive branch and the dominant political party. Moreover, this reform, it is only one of a package of constitutional reforms that have been approved in the past 2 months, such as a reform that empowers the military and a reform that eliminates autonomous constitutional organs. All in all, we have that these reforms meet the definition of democratic backsliding put forward by Professor Nancy Bermeo, that is the state-led debilitation or elimination of the political institutions sustaining an existing democracy. There are also some electoral reforms in the process. So we are witnessing in Mexico something similar to what Professor Sadursky called a quote-unquote constitutional bombardment in the process of democratic erosion in Poland. or what Professor David Landau defined as abusive constitutionalism to explain what happened in Venezuela, or a process of quote-unquote autocratic legalism, as Professor Kim Lane Shepley described what happened in Hungary. The process of democratic erosion in Mexico, I believe, started 6 years ago in the election that former President López Obrador and the legislative coalition led by his party Morena won by a landslide. The judicial and these other reforms illustrate the deepening and acceleration of that process, made possible by the election last June of current President Claudia Sheinbaum and the same legislative coalition. So that's the context I think is important to understand the reform. Now, why the government engaged in this reform? So I want to highlight some backward and forward-looking considerations. What I report here are considerations that I have encountered in different sources, not necessarily that I share. So but the first consideration is sheer revenge. So this is a backward-looking motivation. Current Justice González Alcántara, who was, by the way, appointed by former President López Obrador, recently said in an interview that López Obrador told him that the Supreme Court would regret what he considered illegitimate decisions that by the Supreme Court that hindered his transformation. In the Q&A, we can talk about some of those decisions that prompted the president to say that. So that's the revenge, like one motivation. Second, there are the dynamics between the outgoing and the incoming governments. So at the beginning of the electoral campaign in like January this year, then candidate Claudia Sheinbaum and her main legal advisor, former Supreme Court Justice Arturo Saldívar, publicly said that electing judges was not a great idea and that they were going to propose a different judicial reform that did not include this feature. However, then President López Obrador jumped over and proposed on February 5th a package of 18 constitutional amendments, of which the judicial reform was one, as was the military reform and other reforms that I mentioned before that are currently part of the Constitution. We are still in the process of enacting those 18 reforms. So with this package of reforms, then President López Obrador sought not only to influence the electoral campaign, but also the agenda of the incoming government. This was a forward-looking motivation from the perspective of López Obrador. Current President Claudia Sheinbaum has fully adapted the reform, the judicial reform, and the other reforms. And indeed, her agenda and the energy of her government have been marked by this process of reforms. Third, some commentators have added another forward-looking motivation. Specifically, they have stated that the judicial reform was motivated by President López Obrador's desire to protect his inner circle, I mean family and close allies, who have been pointed out in corruption investigations regarding federal infrastructure programs and the financing of the electoral campaign. This one and previous ones. The judicial reform would then be a kind of insurance against prosecution. Perhaps, as is always the case when we seek to explain social and political phenomena, the true explanation of the reform includes these and other motivations. So finally, there are the consequences for the Mexican democracy of the judicial reform. So I will be brief since Veronica will talk more about the consequences. So it will be hard to measure the specific economic consequences of the judicial reform, for instance, on investment. Would more investment have come to Mexico had the judicial reform not passed? It is a counterfactual that is difficult to evaluate. What we can say is that the perceptions about the Mexican economy have worsened since the election in June, and that at least part of the deterioration in expectations are due to the judicial reform that has been criticized by national and international experts, institutions, organizations, and governments. The judicial reform will likely increase corruption as actors will seek to solve their conflicts outside the judiciary, The judicial elections will also likely be influenced by powerful actors such as economic and perhaps criminal organizations. The reform is a hard blow to judicial independence. Electing judges at high courts is not an idea that I like, but it's not the worst part of the reform. The ex-ante and ex-post mechanisms are worse for judicial independence. But what is truly terrible is that the reform implies getting rid of every single federal judge in the country and also state judges. Since 1994, but the blow to the federal judiciary is especially hard because since 1994, federal judges in Mexico have been selected through examinations of merits and capacities. We have had 30 years of huge investments in human capital. To become an appeals court judge in Mexico, it takes an average of 20 years after entering the judiciary after law school. In those 20 years, the future magistrate occupies different positions, takes courses, probably studies a master or a PhD, makes exams, and eventually becomes first a trial judge and then an appeals judge. All this human capital, the professional guild of the judiciary, of the federal judiciary, is being fired. To become a judge, the reform, as I mentioned, requires only a law degree, 5 years of experience, letters of recommendation. The collective knowledge of the law that is deposited in the federal judiciary is being thrown to the garbage. That expert knowledge is a pillar of judicial independence, as recognized by many theorists, such as Edward Coke, Alexander Hamilton, the French, and the Hispano-American constitutional drafters in the eve of independence. Thus, and with this I close, perhaps the main consequence for Mexico is that the reforms, including the judicial one, are eliminating the self-correcting mechanisms that are part of constitutional democracy. The concentration of power in one branch implies that the system is now going to work with much weaker safeguards, guardrails, and brakes. It is like jumping from an airplane without having tested the parachute. And with that dramatic note, I finish.
Thank you. Veronica.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. I'm not as good as talking like Julio. I need a little bit of support here. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming and thank you for organizing this. It's crucial for Mexico, and it's very important that we keep an eye on what's happening down there. So I want to add a little bit to what Julio mentioned regarding some of the consequences, but I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about like some of the issues that he already highlighted were wrong with the system to begin with. And I find this picture of a mural in the Supreme Court of Mexico always very illustrative of some of the many ailments that the Mexican judiciary has in terms of impunity, which is one of the reasons why this reform can be described as popular among citizens, because they're tired of injustice, they're tired of seeing corruption, of seeing a system that doesn't work for them. But it's a little bit more complex, the issue of impunity. You can think of impunity in Mexico as having two faces. If you're a victim in Mexico of a crime, the odds are against you of the crime ever being solved. I should step back out as well, because I'm going to focus only on my area of expertise, which are criminal cases. I don't work with the civil cases, which are a huge chunk of what the judiciary deals with. But if you're a victim of a crime in Mexico, it's very unlikely your case will ever be solved. You have discrimination, you have distrust from the authorities that do not take you seriously. There's huge neglect. Some of the main issues that Julio was mentioning before And one of the reasons why the system doesn't work is because the prosecutor is not working. The prosecutorial organ is not working. Victims are left without good investigation, no information. They are often re-victimized, and obviously they face corruption as well. Now, things are not looking better if you're an accused in Mexico. There is long detentions, and some of the new reforms that have taken place have made things worse for the accused, with arraigo, which is a form of detention that allows people to be detained without a court order for more than 90 days. There's mandatory pretrial detention, wrongful arrests and convictions, human rights violations like torture for confessions, slow proceedings, that is a thing, yeah, it takes time to be convicted, and also corruption. However, most of these problems cannot really be blamed on judges. As Julio was saying, most of these issues come from either police, the prosecutor, lack or improper implementation of rules, procedures, laws, or bad laws, like having the arraigo or the mandatory pretrial detention. That's just, it was recently, the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights said that those are, should be, they do not follow international law, so they should be stopped. So anyway, there are a lot of problems with the criminal justice system in Mexico. And yes, there is corruption from the judges, but a lot of the things that people hate about the criminal justice system cannot really be blamed on judges. Now, going back a little bit as well on what we, or why we think this is going to be a really bad idea, has to do with how we think about institutional design and how the design of institutions can impact both the independence and the accountability of judges. And this I'm drawing on the work also of Julio and others that have worked extensively on this. But we have to think of institutions in the judiciary, and that includes prosecutors and judges, as being both independent from politics, but also accountable for their behavior. On the side of prosecutors, we know that by institutional design, their independence may vary according to where they are located, in what institution or branch of government they are located. We also know that the accountability of prosecutorial decisions can happen through different mechanisms. One, which is rarely used in Mexico, are disciplinary procedures for prosecutorial misbehavior. And the judges can, in theory, review judicial prosecutorial decisions made. And these, however, require also the participation of the public defense or the defenders advocating for their clients and victims if they have an attorney. So it requires that, you know, legal activism on behalf of different parties. On the side of judges, we know that we want them, ideally, one of the main issues has been the issue of independence that Julio was mentioning earlier. We want judges to be independent from politics, but also we want them accountable for their behavior. There are two ways in which we can think of that accountability. Traditionally, we think of judicial independence by how we divide power in these three different branches of government, and interbranch control has usually served that purpose. This reform is obviously giving that away. And there are other disciplinary procedures. Before the reform, it would have taken place in the hands of the Judicial Council. Now, with this redesign that the AMLO administration began and has been consolidated by the current administration of Sheinbaum, we have just affirmed the public prosecutor is not being touched, like Julio was mentioned. The prosecutors depend on the executive, and the executive is obviously controlled by Morena. The decisions made by prosecutors, what is prosecutor, when, that still remains the monopoly of the public prosecutor's office. Again, internal review, if there are any mechanisms in law, in practice, they are rarely implemented. And moving forward, judicial review will be done by popularly elected judges, very likely Morena members or, judges that are voted because they were drafted from this Morena movement. Like the appeal that the Morena party has, it's just massive. And so we know that judges are going to be from Morena loyalists. And again, this leaves the capacity of victims or defendants or other parties in a judicial process to appeal decisions. But this review at the end is going to be made based on whatever the political will is of the elected judge. Judges will now depend on politics, and as it's obvious, and I just mentioned, it's going to be dominated by Morena loyalists. There's likely, the accountability. One of the things that President Sheinbaum has said is that now judges are going to be accountable to the people because they're going to be elected. And if they misbehave, they're going to be, voted out in the next year. In the next 6 years. She has said that no judge is above the people. And she said this recently after there was an appeal to try to take down the constitutional reform. And they brought that down. There's also the internal mechanism for accountability that they are instituting with the implementation of this disciplinary tribunal that Julio mentioned, that the idea, yes, it's to provide, control and review the appointments and the behavior of judges. But there's language there that it's pretty worrisome, and they are there to also sanction judges that rule against the interests of the people, whatever those interests might be. These 6 people that are going to be appointed in the disciplinary tribunal are going to define what those interests are. So this emphasis on the people, this is obviously a very populist motivated reform, brings to the front the question of if this judiciary of the people, by the people, for the people is actually the solution to the problem of impunity. Let's just entertain that thought for a second. And I was thinking about it, and I've been doing research on perceptions of procedural justice. And a lot of this literature says, and there has been some evidence of this, that if people feel the proceedings are fair, they may be more willing to comply with the law. They may think better of their institutions. There might be more institutional legitimacy. And overall, people will feel better about the rule of law. And a lot of this depends on the experiences, the actual experiences and perceptions of quality of treatment that they receive. These experiences as perceptions of quality depend on individuals that experience proceedings, see the proceedings as being neutral, that they were treated with respect, that they had a voice, that they were feeling heard. So for a moment, you can think, okay, maybe if the judges are elected by the people, for the people, maybe there might be some impact on procedural justice. And there's also evidence recently that actually this does matter. Just procedures do matter more than the judicial outcome. Recent surveys we did with prisoners in Central America suggest this. So maybe if they have judges that make them feel like they're, part of that they're being seen and heard and the proceedings are good, then maybe that would be good for procedural justice and eventually for rule of law. My guess is that's not going to be the case, because how will a popularly elected judge help the victims with the problem of impunity when less than 3.5% of criminal cases reported to the public prosecutor's office actually reaches a court in Mexico? The reform is not helping with how the public prosecutor selects, investigates cases, and takes them to the court, for further investigation, and it's not helping with that. Therefore, this reform will leave most victims of crime out of reach. They will continue to experience impunity. They will continue to experience prosecutorial neglect, lack of information. If there is an investigation done, it's going to be inefficient, and there's going to be re-victimization. If cases get to a court, which is a very small percentage of criminal cases that reach a court, another layer of problems that victims face is judges that are sometimes, if it's a gender violence case, judges are usually poorly trained in how to deal with gender violence. And victims complain usually about how judges rule without taking into account the specifics of the case. Like they don't necessarily know how to deal with gender violent cases. Just to give one example. So I don't think that's going to change when you put judges that are less qualified than the ones that we currently have. Now, on the side of the accused, with elected judges, they will continue to experience the same, actually, they might experience more pre-trial detention, more because the push is against crime, to be tough on crime, right? So probably they're going to be sent more to pre-trial detention, probably we'll see more wrongful arrests, conviction. I don't see this leading to less torture if the animus is to curb down on, the criminals and bring security back to the people. So I think a lot of this language motivating the reform is actually make things worse for the accused. Proceedings that have currently been, criticized as slow and affecting the right to a speedy trial may be even longer, because it's very likely that judges will decide their agendas and their calendars based on the electoral cycle. And maybe they will postpone ruling on a case after the election, or will decide to rule a case in a certain way just to win the election. So I think the whole thing for the accused is not looking great. And one of the core issues or problems that do affect judges is the issue of corruption. And I think different forms of corruption will remain and probably will exacerbate with the introduction of elections. So going back to the issue of corruption, how will a popularly elected judge help with the issue of prosecuting state agents, either for human rights violations or corruption, where the interests of the state are usually low? Like I mentioned before, the PPO remains the institution with a monopoly to choose what cases to investigate and which individuals to accuse. And these may be even more, if we think of the potential motivations behind the reform, if this is a revenge reform, then we know more or less what these type of prosecutions may look like. They're not going to be sincere prosecutions against corruption. They're going to be targeted, prosecutions against political enemies. The courts, again, will decide, adjudicate cases depending on the political will, interest of the judge, which is defined by the popular vote and the interests of the ruling party. And this is not going to be good for victims. They might still have the right to appeal decision, but again, these appeals depend on the judge that will take the appeal and will, give them reason to do that. And that will depend on the political will or interest of the judge. So I think we're going to see less adjudication of politically and popularly relevant cases, which is the majority of the criminal cases that we have in Mexico, and maybe more adjudication of politically convenient and popular cases, which gets to the point that Julio was mentioning, that maybe there might be some revenge prosecutions coming up soon. In sum, I don't think that this is a good idea in the short term. Some people in Mexico may think this is a good idea. It may be popular among some sectors of the citizenry, But in the medium and the long term, I don't think it solves the root problems of impunity. It does not decrease, obviously, insecurity doesn't do anything for that. I don't think it will impact corruption. So I don't think it's good news for anyone involved in a criminal case, and much less for the rule of law in Mexico. So thank you very much. And those are my 2 cents on the issue. Thank you.
Leah, that was yours.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for having me. I am glad to be the last minute addition to the panel. I am here to talk to you guys about a piece that Andrew and I wrote for Foreign Policy, which was born out of the concern or out of the need to sort of think through how we would apply the academic literature and political science that we knew to this debate on this judicial reform. So we sort of visualized the debate as having 2 main sides. One of them that said we have to return power to the people. This is a democratic move against a judicial system that has become like increasingly separated, elitist, and like abstract for the Mexican like population. And on the other side, we have arguments that this is on net bad for democracy and an example of democratic erosion, and this is an unfeasible institutional implementation. So we were trying to think sort of like how we think about those 2 sides in contrast, and I think we came up with 2 main points. The first is that the scholarly consensus is that the popular election of judges is on net bad for judicial independence. That is something that we know. We don't, however, know that it is as like this huge example of democratic erosion that has been presented so far. I think on one side of the debate, we have this idea that like judicial independence ending, or the popular election of judges ends judicial independence and therefore ends democracy. It is unclear to us that is necessarily the case. The popularly elected judges exist in a bunch of countries. They coexist with democracy, for example, in the United States. And so it is maybe not as black and white as it would be made to seem. On the second side, we have this question of institutional design, where we say, well, this reform is often compared to institutions in what is like the democratic ideal, in which case we do think this reform is not the democratic ideal. But comparing it to the flawed existing Mexican judicial institutions, is this an improvement overall? We say no to both. We say, one, it is not an improvement overall. We're going to focus today on the particular institutional flaws that the design has. However, we say if you fix these institutional design flaws, there is no need for this to be as fatal to democracy as it has been presented so far. So we argue that the real problem with the judicial overhaul is not the direct election of judges, but rather just the specific design of those elections. And we accept the fact that this is on that like very appealing to democratic electors. So let's start with the first, what we see as being the first flaw of the institutional design. The first is that it overwhelms voters with too many choices. So we have an election with thousands of seats up for grabs, where we have up to 9 candidates for each election. These are spread, as we said already, into 2 different election cycles. We can imagine that this looks on a ballot as a ballot with thousands of names on this at once. It is unrealistic to expect that citizens will have a meaningful democratic choice when it is not possible for them to realistically know the positions of each one of the people on the ballot. The reform also stipulates that these candidates can't use any public or private funds for their campaigns. Instead, they're each to be granted equal time on television to present their cases. Again, feasibility concern when you think of thousands of candidates at once, how we're going to get them all on television, give them equal time and allow them to have a meaningful conversation with voters. This doesn't seem like a real thing to us, which means 2 things. On one side, it means that it's not as democratic as it may seem, because voters aren't making meaningful choices, right? Because it's impossible for us to know the track record of each judge. On the other side, it also means that all of these concerns about popular preferences mobilizing which cases get taken on and which decisions are made is less, I think, concerning when we think about the fact that voters may just not be that interested in participating in these elections, and it is unrealistic for them to keep track of these many judges. And so we actually looked at where similar reforms have been implemented, and we find that across Latin America, elections like this have incredibly low turnout. and high incidences of blank ballots. It turns out that like people don't want to vote for judges, they don't care to show up to vote for judges. And they also, when they do, they tend to vote blank in protest instead. So they're not actually making this choice, which is two concerning consequences. The first is obviously that the election is tipped by few meaningful votes. That means that parties often get to mobilize and decide who wins, but it also means that these elections are decided on very, like, it's easy to gain control, right? And it's easy to gain control both from the Morena party, which is a concern that we already talked about, but it's also easy, I think, and a big concern, to gain control by business leaders, cartel capos, social media influencers who might be able to mobilize people whose participation in and like free speech can't practically be regulated by this reform. So we think about these like few marginal votes that are likely to make the difference in who ends up on the bench. People don't typically care, so it's going to be the most interested people who are actually showing up to make this decision. It tends to be that those people are not the people who we want making these choices. So we don't want the business leaders showing up to make these choices when nobody else is. And so this means that we think that this reform puts the Mexican judicial system at like an increased risk of special interest influence, right? Especially in a case where Mexico has a bad track record of two things. First, voter intimidation, where there's a lot of reports of independent observers who observe political parties showing up, intimidating voters, forcing them on buses and taking them to the polls, but also outright violence. So candidates for local office who are identified as rivals by criminal groups are often targets of political assassinations in Mexico. So you can imagine that this reform is affecting now not only how judges act once they're elected, but it's also affecting who wants to be a judge and who's willing to put themselves through a process like this. Having established these sort of like feasibility concerns, we also think that this is in fact quite troublesome in the way that it's written. The institutional design is quite troublesome for Mexico and democratic backsliding for two main reasons. The first is that it's the reform, the way that it's written and the way it's going to be implemented is, I think, overtly designed to entrench Morena power. And this is for the reason that they're electing all Supreme Court judges at once, which means that everybody gets moved out and the Morena, who now has supermajority control in the legislature, gets to put up all their candidates. So the way candidates are selected matters. And the way that they're selected right now means that Morena gets to select almost all the candidates. There is no guaranteed way for the opposition to put up candidates. So voters are not getting a meaningful choice. Instead, they're just getting their pick of the already Morena approved candidates. And the second is this idea of executive aggrandizement, which I think we've sort of already touched on, which is the fact that there are a bunch of checks on Mexican presidential power that López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum have already expressed a desire to sort of roll back. And we know that liberal leaders use friendly judiciaries to interpret countries' constitutions in more friendly ways. Mexico explicitly has a constitutional ban on re-election. Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua, and Nayib Bukele of El Salvador have already used their friendly judiciaries to undermine constitutions to ban re-election. So we think that this is a real concern, especially with the fact that Morena now gets to pick every single judge, every single candidate, and entrench their power for at least the next 6 years. All right, thank you.
So I checked with she who is in charge, and she said I could go first. Two quick questions. I guess for anyone who, you don't all have to answer it, but anyone who wishes. First, what do we know about public opinion and how much public support there is or is not for this reform, and how whether that has mattered? And secondly, I certainly understand the very real risk that this court packing, and this is a radical court packing, will help to lock in Morena power. That seems like a very serious risk. In the event that it doesn't do it sufficiently such that we get a sort of normalization of electoral politics in 5 or 6 or 8 years, I don't think that Sheinbaum is going to maintain anywhere near the level of public support that AMLO did. At some point, incumbents are losing everywhere in the world except for Mexico. At some point, Morena is going to lose some strength, and either he's going to have to govern in a very authoritarian way, which seems difficult, or we're going to see a rebalancing of power a bit. If this more optimistic scenario plays out, maybe not in 3-6, but maybe in 8 or 10 years, how would this system work in a more pluralist system where one party doesn't have a supermajority in the legislature, and actually, if we went back to something more similar to Mexico in the early 21st century, where you had a roughly tripartite fragmentation, as Julio put it, of parties in the legislature. How would this system work? Somebody has to answer.
Julio, do you want to give it a shot?
I'll start with it.
How are you? Do I start? Okay.
Sure.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so two great questions. So first, the public opinion. First, the Mexican people are it's very confused regarding different institutions in the judicial system. So yes, if people is asked whether they trust the judiciary as such, it's like a low percentage, like 30-35% in average. But people do not distinguish between the local, the state judges, the prosecutors, the Supreme Court, the federal judges. So it is as we were saying, like the main problem, like the perception of corruption is due mainly to the bad performance of prosecutors, state judges. In a sense, the federal judiciary is not without problems. I mean, don't get me wrong, it has a lot of problems, but it was the best part of the system. I mean, it has been under reform for 30 years, and it shows, and people who actually interact with the federal judiciary can tell you that. And now the reform is being proposed. I mean, it was suggested by López Obrador and then supported by President Claudia Sheinbaum, and they enjoy still a large approval rate. I mean, the last poll gave President Sheinbaum 70% of overall approval, which is it's a lot. Now, if we look at specific issues like security and for instance, security is the worst, then her approval rates in a specific issue goes down. And I think, as you said, it will be hard to keep high approval rates consistently as López Obrador did. But the worst, I mean, in Mexico, the worst president except Peña Nieto scored above 50% in approval rates. I mean, it is rare for a president to score lower than 50% of approval. So, and I think it will be the case. I mean, there is like a strong perception, like favorable disposition, let's say, towards the presidency. And we have seen this low approval rate that we have had 2 months of a judges' strike. Judges and judicial official strikes, they like really stopped. I mean, it was like a not proper strike. They still decided emergency cases, but they stopped for 2 months. And the mass people, let's put it like that, did not accompany the judges. There was some members of the bar, law students, the judges associations, of course, and other I mean, there was a lot of support, but within like a small circle, not the mass population. So yeah, that's probably why the President López Obrador proposed this reform, or one of the reasons why he proposed it. Now, assuming that sometime in the future we go back to a pluralistic system with like 2-3 parties with representation in Congress. Yeah, so the elections will, so there is a filter, a screening mechanism for who can become a judge. And the selection committee lies in the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary. So if the executive controls, as I think it will be likely, the Supreme Court by then, and the executive branch, of course, they will be able to propose 2/3 of the candidates. So the pluralism as expressed in the two chambers of Congress will be able to influence only 1/3 of the candidates. And 2/3 or a bit if the Supreme Court is not controlled. Then there are the ex post mechanism, so that there will be the judicial the disciplinary tribunal. So it will be also they will be elected. So I don't know. In the election, so that 3 committees participate in the judicial tribunal, no? In the disciplinary tribunal. So yeah, it will change a bit. The main problem that I was mentioning, that federal judges are fired, will still be there, because this repository of knowledge regarding the laws and the jurisprudence and what has been, the interpretation of the Mexican laws in the last 3 decades will be lost, because judges will be selected for 1 term of 9 years only. After that, they will be gone, and there will be new election for that position. So that is like not a good mechanism, I think, for judges at all levels, not only the Supreme Court, for all judges. So the system will be back to something workable, I think, something better than strong concentration, executive aggrandizement, but will be very impractical, I would say, and will still have a lot of executive influence in the composition of the judiciary.
Just be clear, so public opinion favors the reform according to the surveys?
Depends on the survey, but I would say, yeah, some like 40-45% in some polls approve the reform. In others, a little bit more than that. Yeah.
And I think most people didn't understand, like when they voted in July, I think a lot of people didn't realize this was what the reform entailed. Like they just voted for the movement and whatever they represent without much thought. And every attempt to try to have a dialogue was always dismissed by AMLO or at the moment, the candidate Sheinbaum as, oh, they're either external people, they don't know anything about Mexico, or they're fifis, these bourgeois people that are out of touch of the people. So any criticism has always been silenced and not allowing a lot of critical thinking and debate among citizens. So I think that shapes that. Now, thinking about the future, I think that's a really good question. My concern is the politicization of the judiciary. And I think the fact, not only the loss of human capital, judicial knowledge, the quality of, legal argumentation is going to decrease. It's already a concern among many attorneys about some of the rulings are not necessarily, using international law, which is a huge issue, especially for human rights cases. So all of these human capital is going to be gone. I think it's also how they're going to be ruling when they are thinking of elections. And yes, other countries have implemented elections, the US being a case one of them, but it's not done across the board. you have at the end, you know, the Supreme Court. And we know what happens when you start to, you know, align your Supreme Court towards just the interests of one party. Like, but we know that in the US, that's gonna change eventually. So but the consequences are much longer here. So maybe because in Mexico, the Supreme Court terms are gonna be shorter, maybe the consequences of momentary one-party rule is gonna be shorter. I don't know. I think it's not good.
I think something that we have to wrestle with when opposing this reform is that it is unclear to me that the existing institutions do any better in the face of the supermajority in both chambers. So we're worried about court packing. It's true that like they can nominate and they're going to be able to nominate most of the Supreme Court by the time Sheinbaum is done. We're worried, for example, a critique that's often made against this reform is that this is the end of career judges because there won't be a meritocracy anymore. Judges that are confirmed by Congress still go through this favoritism process. It's unclear to me that that institution is much worse than what it already is. So I think there's sort of like this we have to be careful, I think, when on balance, we think about what the reality is of the Mexican judicial system now versus the reform and like not comparing it to what the democratic ideal, I think, would be.
Yeah, in that case, we have to remember that AMLO came from the PRI. And I think a lot of what it's this idea of hegemony, like having control of, like, I think this is part of getting there, but in a populist driven base. So yes, I think there are a lot of concerns, not only on meritocracy, the quality of the judiciary in the future, but what this might mean for opposition for any opposition in the future, and how that may trigger or further debilitate democracy, especially since they are considering other reforms, and who knows what those might be.
Okay, I've got Carla, Manuel, and then over here on the left.
Thank you. So I have 2 or 3 questions. The first one is, Julio, you mentioned, you set the discussion in the framework of democratic erosion. And I think you also mentioned that there is a military reform going on. So I wonder whether we should read these 2 reforms together and what that reading would be. The second question is about, so the constitutional reform or the judiciary reform is already approved. And I wonder whether there are any instances to appeal for that. I mean, to remove that reform, in particular in terms of the procedural ways in which the reform has been approved. There were cases in Oaxaca that the majority was not gained in a proper way. So whether they can appeal to some form of procedimental argument against it. And then, Veronica, you mentioned human rights, and I was wondering how much the international covenants and treaties could be appealed against the judicial reform.
We can go in the same order.
Should I go?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I just want to say something that I agree with Maria. Maria made a very good point that, in a sense, the reform was unnecessary. Like given the conditions of the election, I mean, it was natural for the Supreme Court and the judges to be different to supermajorities in the elected branches. And President Sheinbaum could have appointed at least, I think, 3 or 4 justices in her 6-year period. So the Supreme Court would have gravitated towards the majority, the position. That's like a regular functioning in a democracy. The lower court federal judges, though, I don't agree, because they remain in their positions for life, and they are selected through merit and competitions. Yes, of course, there are problems. It's not a perfect system. I have studied the flaws, but it has nothing to do with what they are doing now. That is, they are just firing everybody. No. Now yes, I do think that was my first point. I do think that we have to. That it's better to look at the judicial reform as part of this set of reforms. The military reform and the reform that eliminates the constitutional organs, the reform that increases the crimes for which judges should give automatic prison to people. There is like one clear way to do that. That's why it's part of this executive aggrandizement. So for me, it is clear, like when you take everything in consideration, it is clear the process of concentration of power in the executive branch. So take, for instance, the military reform transfer the National Guard, that is supposed to be a civil body, to the armed forces. Actually, this was a reform that President López Obrador tried to pass during his term. He didn't gather the 2/3 majority to change the constitution. So then he published an executive decree to move the National Guard to the armed forces. What happened is that, of course, that decree was challenged before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had two choices. You let it pass and commit institutional suicide because it is obviously unconstitutional, or you declare it unconstitutional and face the political consequences. You remember I mentioned that President López Obrador told one of the justices, "You will regret this decision." It was that. It was the decision to declare unconstitutional the decree to transfer the National Guard to the armed forces. So then now the military reform has been passed. The National Guard is part of the military, and the National Guard has military privileges, is within the military jurisdiction. It has prosecutorial powers. So if we combine that with the elected and faceless judges, and with automatic prison, that is another reform. Automatic prison means there is a list of 19 crimes, and the list is being increased as we speak because they are deciding upon this reform. 19 crimes, including corruption as that merit automatic prison. I mean, if the prosecutor charges you with one of those crimes, the judge cannot do anything. You go to prison. So then the power of the executive branch is really clear. Finally, but I probably will leave this to Vero. Yeah, the reform was challenged because the Supreme Court. So the Mexican Supreme Court faced the decision whether to declare a constitutional reform unconstitutional. It couldn't, but I leave this to Veronica. I mean, the decision was made last week.
Well, I think it didn't pass. That's basically the bottom line. They didn't get the majority vote to make it unconstitutional. And I think, and there was this other attempt by a state judge, right? Julio, I'm less familiar with that case. I think that's the case of Oaxaca that was brought up before. And they wanted, as a district court judge wanted the government to take down the law, the reform from the Diario Oficial, which is basically how reforms are made into law. And the judge was reported to the Judicatura, which is the Judicial Council. And there's going to be, they want some disciplinary mechanism. And that's where the quote of no law is, no judge is above the will of the people came from. Like there's like, this is the will of the people. The Constitution says that laws are made by the people and we pass the law. So I think it's going to go forward. I don't think there might be some other attempts to appeal the reform. It's likely that someone may bring a case to the Inter-American Commission and maybe it will get to the Inter-American Court. especially because some of the aspects of that are part of the reform, and for instance, the prisión preventiva y oficiosa, which is the mandatory, how did you translate it? Mandatory prison, is arguably gonna be made, it's gonna increase the menu of crimes that are gonna be included there as part of this tough on crime populist message of the current administration. So it's likely that more people are gonna be sent to pretrial detention automatically, without, like, it's just, and it's not the first country in Latin America that does that. But I don't think, like, this is gonna take years, and I don't think an inter-American court is gonna be able to change a constitutional reform. They may require the state to try to remedy some of the damage that is gonna be done to probably many thousand of individuals across the country, but I don't think the remedies are gonna be substantive unless there are changes on how these changes are gonna impact the everyday operation of the court systems. Because we're gonna lose, like, I can see already many decisions being made without well thought judicial argumentation. I can see procedural mistakes being made by unqualified elected judges. I don't think it's gonna be smooth as it might sound, for not only because of all the different logistical issues that were mentioned before Maria that were very accurate. So I think I'm gonna leave it at that. I think I covered the thing, the question regarding human rights appeals. I think they may happen, but it will take time.
Okay, we are rapidly running out of time, and I had 4 hands up. Let me take all 4 questions and ask, no, scratch that, beg that you make your questions short and concise, and then we'll have a kind of a lightning round of responses. So I had Manuel, I'm sorry I don't know your name, your second, Andrew, and yeah.
Okay, very quickly. Number one, I'm confused about how the actual voting will work. I understand how judges will get on the ballot, but how does voting work? Do we know anything about the actual electoral rules? Who votes where for whom, and how are votes counted and translated into seats? That's number one. And number two, we're supposed to be debating this reform, and I think all of you are kind of on the same side of this, between skepticism to alarm, somewhere in that range. Does anyone just want to give a shot at giving us the kind of best Morenista pitch for this? Not because I disagree with what you said, but just because I feel like I want to know this so I can be prepared in case I run into one of these characters.
I tried to get Vidi Rios, and she's on vacation.
Okay, sure.
Many Morena supporters who
yeah,
all
we're trying
appear
to
to be
get
on
many.
vacation. or
Try.
not watching.
Okay.
Great question.
So I have a clarification question, just to piggyback on what Manuel said, like in terms of the mechanism of voting, like is this by region, by state, by city? That was unclear to me as well. Another clarification I had was for Veronica. You said gender violence. What does that mean? Is that rape, domestic violence, or is it some random woman walking around hitting men with on the head with stilettos as gender violence? I don't know what that means in Mexico. And then my last clarification question was for her. When you talk about democratic ideal, what does that mean? Because like even in the US, even if you take away my conspiracy theory that presidential candidates have been decided hundreds of years before people get to vote on it. Even that, I mean, it's decided by the electoral vote, even before the electoral Congress, that was decided by rich white men who are landowners. So there's never been like so what do you consider a democratic ideal? It just seems kind of, I don't know, privileged type of view you had on there, which I don't disagree with, but. And then the other one is by businesses, like, is it controlled by like, how are the businesses in Mexico? Is it like a lot of small businesses that are running the country? Or is it like big corporations that are running it like the US? I don't know, so.
Andrew.
Great presentation, Julio. I had a question for you, as I think you very helpfully explained why AMLO wanted to attack the courts, but there are a lot of places where leaders attack the courts but don't succeed. And so I wanted to know, given that Sigamos Haciendo Historia did not have a supermajority in the Senate, why did the PRI and the PAN fail to block the reform? And why did the societal mobilization fail to pressure Morena's coalition partners to defect and withdraw their support?
Great Spanish pronunciation, by the way. Got it.
He speaks perfect Spanish.
So first, thank you all. It's great to hear. I will try to be very succinct, but I know it's not an easy question. So like Morena is on power, second term, the reform is approved. So if you could change one, what is the very worst thing about it that you would change? If you are called by Claudia and she asks okay, I got that you are opposing this. What is the very bad, the worst thing here that you would change? Slash, if you could, given these political conditions, add something, because all of you, I think agree that we have a bad judicial system in Mexico. So if you could add something that would really make a difference, what would that be?
I like how you're on first name basis with Claudia.
The last name is too complicated.
Oh, come on. All right, we got couple of minutes each, 2-3 minutes max each. We'll go around same order once you. All right, reverse order. Let's go crazy.
Okay, I think I have two responses to this. The first is I think my point was exactly that the democratic ideal is sort of like this unreachable thing. And I think this critique is born out of the frustration, I think, that sometimes opposition to the regime doesn't wrestle with, not opposition to the regime, opposition to the reform doesn't wrestle with the reality of Mexico. And so we put out these big statements about how it's bad for democracy and it's backsliding, but we don't compare it to the reality. And so I think the point that I was trying to make is that we have to think about how we live in a world with supermajorities. Court capture is going to happen either way. And then considering that, we have to compare the reform to the status quo and not to what we would want the Mexican judicial system to be. And I think our point then was exactly to try to make these suggestions as to how we, I think we're at a point where we sort of accept the fact that Mexico is going to elect its judges by popular vote. So we have to think about how we're going to do that in a way that isn't awful. And so I think our main suggestions are that we should be staggering these elections. There's no reason for them to happen all at once. Staggering these elections means that we no longer have the problem of having thousands of candidates at the ballot. We no longer have the problem of the supermajority being able to take over everything. We no longer have a problem where we have all set of new and experienced judges who don't really know what they're doing all at once. We can keep some of the new blood with the people who are career judges and sort of ease this transition. I think our second recommendation was that it's vital for the opposition to have a venue to meaningfully propose candidates, right? So the way that reform is written right now, it means that it exacerbates this court capture problem. That's not necessary. We could have opposition mechanisms for the opposition, for example, in Congress, to be the one proposing the Congress's set of candidates. It doesn't have to be this way. And in fact, there are not ideal, but more successful countries that do it this way.
Veronica.
Hi. Okay, so what I would like to address what I think might be good. There may be, if I want to advocate of what may happen good, the devil's advocate question that someone raised. That was my attempt to talk about procedural justice. That maybe there might be some people that may feel heard, seen, if the judge comes from the neighborhood. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to get quality justice. But it might be populist justice. The gender violence question, what do I mean by that? It's basically crimes against women for the fact that they're women. We have a couple of laws that deal with it. It includes domestic violence, but it goes beyond that. So it includes, when we talk about gender-related violence, we're talking about femicide and domestic violence and intra-family violence, crimes of that sort. And I would like also to address the question of why, or if there's anything that I would change, what would that be, that one thing? I think I would change how the Supreme Court justices are elected. I think that's, if we can protect something, I think we should protect the highest chamber, and leave that, you know, as shielded as possible from politics. Elect the rest if you want, but at least have someone, it's gonna sound very paternalistic, but have someone that keeps the house sane, and that, you know, is able to provide some legal certainty and across time. And I'll leave it at that, because I do have other things that I would change, but you said one, so I'll leave it there. Julio?
Thank you. So as for the voting mechanisms, we know some things, other things in the Constitution were left to the laws that haven't been enacted. So we really don't know. I mean, a lot of discretion was given to the Electoral Institute to organize the election, and they have not given us the exact procedures. But what we do know is that everybody in the country will vote for the high courts, the Electoral Court, the Supreme Court, and the Disciplinary Tribunal. So we will vote for the positions there. And the rest of the judicial elections, at least at the federal level, will take place by judicial circuit. And there are 32 circuits in Mexico. So we will vote in, I live in the first circuit. I will vote for my correspondent district judges and circuit judges, only in my district. So the people who live in other districts will vote for the judges. So so apparently the Constitution says that there will be up to 30 positions for each vacancy, and that each citizen will vote for each position. However, now they are talking about having not one vote for each position, but for instance, for the Supreme Court, that there will be 9 positions, we will have only 3 votes. And then they will like pull together the votes and then just rank the candidates who got more votes and select based on that. But we don't know. I mean, that's to be decided. Also, how will the ballot look like? We don't know. We don't know if the order of the candidates will be alphabetical or otherwise. We know that had a huge impact on the Bolivian elections, for instance, for high courts. So, but those details aren't known yet. Now, it is hard as an academic, kind of contra natura, to be so one-sided in this particular case, instead of having the pros and cons on this hand and on the other hand. But there is a huge consensus on the flaws of this reform. I mean, experts, national, international organizations, the United Nations Rapporteur of Judicial Independence, there are like the International Bar of, etc. I mean, there's a lot of opposition. I will give you the best Morenista pitch that I think is out there. And this is, by the way, Viri Rios' position. Because she always says, I don't like the reform. So she agrees with the flaws, at least with some of the flaws. However, is what the people wanted. So her position at the best Morenista thing is, well, it may be good or bad, probably bad, it has flaws, but it's what the people wanted. And we live in a democracy, and that is democracy. I don't buy that argument, but I won't discuss that here because that is, as far as I can see, the best Morenista pitch. That, it's what the majority wanted, and that's democracy. And then, what would I change? I have a different opinion from Veronica's. I do care, but I wouldn't save the Supreme Court. I mean, we can elect the Supreme Court. I would save the district and circuit court judges. This human capital that I've been talking about. I mean, actually, the project that one of the justices proposed to the Supreme Court to declare the reform partly unconstitutional was exactly that. Let's elect the Supreme Court, that's fine. But let's not elect, let's declare unconstitutional the election of the district and circuit court judges at the federal level. I agree with that because that's that's where this knowledge of the laws is deposited, as I have been arguing. And lastly, why AMLO succeeded, why the opposition could not stop this. That is like a broader question, very important, but that points to the deeper causes. I mean, not only of this reform, but for the entire political change that we are witnessing in Mexico. And I would agree, and I would say other countries as well. So AMLO in 2018 in his campaign put the finger on long-standing critical issues in Mexico. Poverty, inequality, corruption, impunity. I mean, he was right. A lot of people voted for him. What happened since is a different story. And he was also lucky in his 6 years. And he's a shrewd politician. I mean, very, very capable, I mean, in maneuvering. The opposition is in a very bad shape, and they haven't been able to recover. And AMLO, the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and their party, Morena, still enjoy huge popular support because I think they were right in pointing at some issues. Now, at some point, we will see the consequences of giving to them so much power. I think we are already witnessing it, but that's yeah, it's a harder question, that one.
Thanks, Julio. Before I close, let me just remind you that next week's Tuesday seminar is Political Scientist Nathan Seguin. It's titled Dangerous Stereotypes, Correcting Misperceptions About Undocumented Immigrants to Promote Inclusionary Preferences. A clunky title, but a pretty pertinent topic. Please join me in thanking Veronica, Michel, Julio, Rios, Figueroa, and Maria Baistero.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.